To truly understand the devastating impact of what was about to unfold at my birthday party, you need to know exactly who I really am, and why I had spent 8 months allowing my son David to believe he was managing the affairs of a helpless elderly woman who needed his guidance and protection. The truth about my identity and capabilities would soon destroy every assumption he had made about power, respect, and the treatment of elderly family members. But first, you need to see the world exactly as I had been seeing it during those months of systematic character testing. My name is Eleanor Richardson, and I am the founder, majority owner, and chief executive officer of Richardson Industries, a manufacturing empire that I built from nothing over the course of 42 years into one of Pennsylvania's most successful and influential business enterprises. What started as a small machine shop in my garage in 1982 had grown into a diversified manufacturing company with 4 major facilities, 2,300 employees, and annual revenues exceeding $200 million across multiple industrial sectors. But the scope of Richardson Industries was only part of the story. Over the decades, I had systematically expanded our operations to include precision manufacturing for aerospace components, specialized tooling for automotive production, custom fabrication for energy infrastructure projects, and advanced materials processing for technology applications. Our client list included Fortune 500 corporations, major defense contractors, municipal utilities, and international manufacturing consortiums that depended on our expertise and reliability for critical components and specialized services. Richardson Industries wasn't just another regional manufacturing company. We were the dominant industrial employer in Millbrook and the surrounding 3 counties. Our payroll supported nearly 3,000 families directly, and economic impact studies had shown that our operations generated indirect employment for approximately 8,000 additional workers in supporting industries, service businesses, and local commerce throughout central Pennsylvania. When Richardson Industries made strategic decisions about expansion, relocation, or operational changes, those decisions affected the economic stability of entire communities. My personal involvement in the company's operations had evolved over the years from hands-on manufacturing and customer service to strategic planning, major client relationships, and industry leadership roles that had made me one of the most respected figures in Pennsylvania's manufacturing sector. I served on the boards of 3 industry associations, consulted with state economic development agencies, and regularly participated in policy discussions about manufacturing competitiveness, workforce development, and infrastructure investment priorities that shaped economic conditions throughout the region. But what made my situation particularly interesting was how completely I had managed to separate my public professional identity from my private family relationships. David, Sarah, and most of our extended family knew me simply as Eleanor Richardson, retired widow, whose late husband Frank had worked in manufacturing management and left behind a modest pension and Social Security benefits that allowed me to maintain our family home and live quietly in the community where we had raised our children. The deception hadn't been difficult to maintain because I had always been deliberately private about my business activities and professional achievements. Even during the years when Richardson Industries was experiencing its most dramatic growth and expansion, I had kept my home life separate from my corporate responsibilities, attending David's school events and family gatherings as a manufacturing manager's wife, rather than as a business owner and industry leader whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity. Frank, my husband of 45 years, had been my business partner and co-founder from the very beginning, handling operations management, quality control, and customer relationships, while I focused on strategic planning, financial management, and business development. Our partnership had been so seamless and complementary that most people outside our company assumed Frank was the primary business owner, and I was simply a supportive spouse who helped with administrative duties and office management. When Frank passed away 3 years ago, I had inherited his shares in Richardson Industries, making me the sole owner of the entire enterprise. But rather than announcing this transition publicly or making dramatic changes to our family relationships, I had chosen to maintain the same private, modest lifestyle that had always characterized our approach to wealth and business success. David and our other adult children continued to view me as their father's widow, who was living comfortably but modestly on inherited benefits and retirement savings. This decision to maintain my cover as a simple retiree rather than revealing my true identity as one of Pennsylvania's most successful business owners had been motivated by genuine curiosity about my children's character and values. I wanted to understand how they treated elderly family members when they believed those family members had become dependent and potentially burdensome, rather than powerful and potentially beneficial to their own lives and careers. The testing period that had begun 8 months ago with Frank's heart episode had provided me with an unprecedented opportunity to observe David's true attitudes about elderly people, family responsibility, and the treatment of relatives who appeared to need assistance and guidance rather than respect and consultation. Every decision David made about our healthcare, our finances, our living situation, and ultimately our marriage revealed fundamental aspects of his character that I had never been able to assess when he believed I was someone whose opinions and preferences mattered because of my business influence and financial resources. What I discovered during those 8 months was both disappointing and illuminating. David's approach to managing what he believed were our elderly care needs was entirely focused on efficiency, cost control, and social convenience, rather than dignity, autonomy, and respect for our accumulated wisdom and experience. He treated us like problems to be solved, rather than people whose life experiences and perspectives might have value in making decisions about our own circumstances and preferences. The financial management David had undertaken revealed particularly troubling attitudes about elderly people's right to control their own resources and make their own choices about spending priorities and lifestyle preferences. He had implemented a budget that reflected his assumptions about what elderly people should need and want, rather than investigating what we actually preferred or could afford. His approach was fundamentally paternalistic, based on the premise that age automatically reduced our capacity for sound financial judgment and responsible decision-making. But even more concerning was David's attitude toward our relationship and marriage. His recommendation that Frank and I should consider divorce revealed his belief that elderly couples who experienced any conflict or disagreement were better off separated rather than supported in working through their differences and maintaining their long-term partnership. He seemed to view our marriage as a burden that created inconvenience for his management responsibilities, rather than as a relationship that deserved respect and preservation regardless of the challenges it might present. The divorce papers David was planning to present at my birthday party represented the ultimate expression of his paternalistic approach to elderly family members. He had decided that Frank and I were incapable of recognizing that our marriage had become problematic, and that the kindest solution was for him to make the decision for us and present it as a gift that would improve our lives by eliminating a source of stress and complexity that we were apparently too confused or stubborn to address ourselves. What David didn't realize was that every conversation about our supposed financial limitations, every decision about our healthcare and living arrangements, and every assumption about our marriage and personal relationships had been carefully documented and analyzed by someone whose business success had been built on accurate assessment of people's character, motivations, and reliability under pressure. Richardson Industries' success over 4 decades had depended heavily on my ability to evaluate potential employees, business partners, suppliers, and clients based on how they treated people they believed had less power or influence than themselves. The most reliable indicator of someone's true character wasn't how they behaved when they wanted something from you or were trying to impress you. It was how they treated people they believed couldn't benefit their own interests or challenge their decisions and assumptions. During my years building Richardson Industries, I had developed sophisticated methods for assessing character and integrity that went far beyond standard business evaluation techniques. I had learned to observe how potential partners treated service workers, administrative staff, and lower-level employees when they thought no one important was watching. I had discovered that people's true values were revealed most clearly when they believed they were dealing with individuals who couldn't affect their success or reputation. The 8-month testing period with David had been the most comprehensive character assessment I had ever conducted, because it involved observing someone I loved and had raised during a situation where he believed he had complete power and control over people who were dependent on his generosity and guidance. The results had been profoundly disappointing but extremely revealing about his fundamental attitudes toward respect, dignity, and the treatment of elderly family members. But beyond David's character flaws, the testing period had also revealed important information about his wife Sarah, his understanding of family responsibility, and his assumptions about elderly people's worth and capabilities that would be crucial to the consequences and lessons that were about to unfold at my birthday party. Sarah's involvement in managing our supposed elderly care needs had been equally condescending and controlling, but her approach had revealed different aspects of problematic attitudes toward aging and family relationships. While David's paternalism was focused on efficiency and problem-solving, Sarah's approach was more concerned with social appearances and the management of what she clearly viewed as potential embarrassment or inconvenience that elderly in-laws might create for her own social status and family image. Sarah's suggestions for our care and living arrangements had been consistently focused on solutions that would minimize the visibility of our aging and any challenges we might face, rather than supporting our dignity and independence within our existing community and social relationships. She had researched assisted living facilities based primarily on their distance from her neighborhood and social circle, rather than their quality or compatibility with our preferences and personality. Eleanor, I found this lovely senior community about an hour away that has excellent reviews and very reasonable costs, Sarah had mentioned during one of our family meetings. It would give you and Frank a fresh start, where you could meet new people and not have to worry about maintaining your old social connections that might be getting too demanding or complicated for people in your situation. This recommendation revealed Sarah's assumption that elderly people's existing friendships and community relationships were burdens to be eliminated rather than valuable connections to be preserved and supported. Her approach suggested that aging meant automatic social isolation, and that the appropriate response was institutional care that would manage elderly people's social needs through organized activities and supervised interactions, rather than supporting their continued participation in established relationships and community involvement. Sarah's attitude toward our marriage had been even more problematic than David's direct intervention approach. Rather than suggesting divorce as a solution to apparent conflict, Sarah had recommended what she called separate but connected living arrangements that would allow Frank and me to maintain our legal marriage while living in different facilities or care situations that would eliminate the day-to-day interactions that she believed were creating stress and potential health risks. I think Eleanor and Frank could both be much happier if they had their own spaces and care providers but could still visit each other regularly, Sarah had explained to David during one of their planning conversations that I had overheard. That way they could keep their marriage but not have to deal with all the daily conflicts and care coordination that's obviously becoming too much for them to handle successfully. This approach revealed Sarah's belief that elderly marriages were primarily care arrangements rather than emotional partnerships, and that the appropriate response to any challenges was to reduce the complexity and intimacy of the relationship, rather than providing support for working through difficulties and maintaining the connection that had sustained the couple through decades of shared experiences and mutual support. But perhaps most tellingly, both David and Sarah's approach to our situation had been conducted entirely without consulting us about our own preferences, feelings, or insights about our circumstances and needs. They had made all their assessments and recommendations based on external observations and assumptions, rather than asking us what we wanted, what we valued, or what we thought would be most helpful and appropriate for our situation. This failure to include us in decisions about our own lives revealed the most fundamental problem with their approach to elderly family members. They had stopped seeing us as autonomous individuals whose opinions and preferences mattered, and had begun treating us as problems to be managed rather than people whose accumulated wisdom and life experience might actually be valuable in making decisions about complex personal and relational challenges. The birthday party that David had organized was the perfect culmination of 8 months of decisions made without consultation, assumptions made without investigation, and solutions imposed without respect for our autonomy and dignity. Every aspect of the celebration, from the guest list to the venue to the gift he was planning to present, reflected his complete conviction that he understood our situation better than we did, and was qualified to make major life decisions on our behalf. But what David was about to discover was that the helpless elderly mother he had been managing and controlling for 8 months was actually someone whose business success had been built on precisely the kind of character assessment and strategic thinking that he had failed to demonstrate during his management of our supposed care needs. The woman he had been treating as a problem to be solved was actually someone whose professional expertise in evaluating people's integrity and reliability was about to be applied to the most comprehensive assessment of his character that he could ever imagine. Richardson Industries' success had depended on my ability to identify people whose values and integrity made them reliable partners, employees, and business associates, even under pressure and challenging circumstances. The company's reputation for quality, reliability, and ethical business practices had been built by consistently choosing to work with individuals whose character could withstand the tests that inevitably arose in complex manufacturing and business relationships. The most important lesson I had learned during 42 years of business leadership was that people's true character was revealed most clearly when they believed they had power over others, and when they thought their actions wouldn't have consequences for their own interests and success. The way someone treated employees they could fire, suppliers they could replace, or family members they believed were dependent on their generosity told you everything you needed to know about their fundamental values and reliability as partners or associates. David's behavior during the testing period had failed every measure of character and integrity that I had learned to value during my decades of business leadership. His paternalistic approach, his failure to consult us about our own preferences, his assumptions about our capabilities, and his willingness to make major decisions about our lives without our input or consent, had revealed fundamental flaws in his understanding of respect, dignity, and appropriate relationships between family members, regardless of age or apparent circumstances. But beyond the personal disappointment of discovering these character flaws in my own son, David's behavior had also revealed practical problems that would affect his continued employment and career advancement within Richardson Industries. The company's success had always depended on managers and supervisors who demonstrated respect for all employees regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy, who consulted with relevant stakeholders before making decisions that affected other people's work and well-being, and who understood that authority was a responsibility to serve others, rather than an opportunity to control and manage people who appeared to have less power or influence. David's approach to managing what he believed were our elderly care needs had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership style and character traits that would make him unsuitable for advancement within Richardson Industries' management structure. His paternalistic assumptions, his failure to consult with the people most affected by his decisions, and his willingness to override other people's preferences based on his own assessments of their capabilities, were precisely the qualities that would make him unreliable and potentially damaging in positions of greater responsibility within our organization. The birthday party and the divorce papers David was planning to present represented not just a personal family crisis, but also a professional evaluation that would determine his future within the company where he had been working for the past 8 years, completely unaware that his performance was being assessed by the owner and CEO whose personal treatment he had been managing with such disrespect and condescension. As I stood in that community center, surrounded by neighbors and family members who had no idea what they were about to witness, I knew that the next few minutes would reveal the truth about power, assumptions, and consequences that would change David's understanding of everything he thought he knew about his own life, his family relationships, and his professional future. The gift bag he was holding contained divorce papers that represented the culmination of 8 months of character testing that had revealed fundamental flaws in his integrity, judgment, and respect for other people's dignity and autonomy. But what David was about to discover was that those character flaws had consequences that extended far beyond family relationships into professional and financial realities that would affect every aspect of his life and his family's future security and success. The woman he had been treating as a helpless burden was about to reveal herself as the person who controlled not just his employment and career prospects, but also the economic foundation of the entire community where he lived and worked. The elderly mother whose marriage he had decided to manage and dissolve was actually the business leader whose strategic decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity throughout central Pennsylvania. But before I allowed David to complete his presentation and fully reveal his character in front of 40 witnesses, I wanted to observe one final moment of his absolute confidence in his understanding of my situation and his appropriateness in making major life decisions on my behalf. Because in just a few minutes, everything he believed about power, respect, and the treatment of elderly family members was about to be destroyed by the most expensive lesson in assumptions and consequences that any son could ever receive from a mother he had completely underestimated and fundamentally disrespected. The 8 months of systematic character testing had revealed everything I needed to know about David's fundamental attitudes toward elderly family members, his approach to power and control, and his willingness to make major life decisions for people he believed were dependent on his guidance and protection. But the ultimate test would come at my 70th birthday party, when David would finally reveal the complete depth of his disrespect and condescension in the most public and devastating way possible. As October approached and my birthday celebration drew near, David's paternalistic management of what he believed were our elderly care needs had escalated into what he clearly viewed as necessary intervention in our marriage and personal relationships. The months of observing Frank and me navigate the normal disagreements and compromises that characterize any long-term partnership had convinced David that our marriage had become problematic and potentially harmful to both of our health and well-being. "Mom, I've been thinking about your and Dad's situation," David announced during one of our weekly family dinners in late September. "The stress and conflict between you two isn't good for either of you, especially with Dad's heart condition and your own need for stability and peace during your retirement years." This conversation revealed the culmination of David's 8-month transformation from helpful son to controlling family manager, who believed he was qualified to make fundamental decisions about our most personal and important relationships. "Sarah and I have been discussing what would be best for both of you," David continued, "and we think the kindest thing we could do would be to help you both start fresh and focus on your individual happiness and health without the complications and stress of trying to maintain a marriage that's clearly not working anymore." The presumption in David's statement was breathtaking. He had decided, without consulting either Frank or me, that our 45-year marriage was not working, and that the kindest thing would be for him and Sarah to help us start fresh by ending our relationship and restructuring our lives according to their assessment of what would be best for our health and happiness. "David, what exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading based on the legal research and consultation activities I had observed him conducting over the previous months. "Mom, Sarah and I have researched the process for divorce when couples are in your situation," David replied, using the same tone he had employed when discussing heating system repairs and medical care coordination. "It's actually quite straightforward when there aren't complicated financial arrangements or custody issues to resolve. You and Dad could both be much happier living independently without the stress of managing a relationship that's obviously causing problems for both of you." David's casual discussion of our divorce as a straightforward process revealed his complete conviction that Frank and I were incompetent to recognize our own marital problems and make appropriate decisions about our relationship future. His reference to our situation showed his assumption that elderly couples with limited resources and simple care needs could have their most personal decisions managed efficiently by younger family members, with better judgment and understanding of what would be best for everyone involved. "David, have you asked Frank how he feels about ending our marriage?" I inquired, testing whether David's intervention approach included consultation with the people most affected by his decisions. "Mom, Dad is obviously struggling with the same relationship stress that's affecting you," David replied. "He's just too proud or confused to admit that the marriage isn't working anymore. Sometimes family members need to make difficult decisions for elderly relatives who can't see their situations clearly or aren't willing to take the steps necessary to improve their own well-being and happiness." This statement revealed the complete scope of David's paternalistic transformation. He had decided that both Frank and I were too proud or confused to recognize our own marital problems, and that family members, meaning himself and Sarah, needed to make difficult decisions for elderly relatives who lacked the cognitive clarity and emotional honesty to manage their own personal relationships appropriately. David's approach to our marriage reflected the same character flaws that had characterized his management of our medical care, financial planning, and household maintenance throughout the testing period. He had replaced consultation with assumption, respect with control, and partnership with management, treating us as problems to be solved rather than autonomous individuals whose preferences and insights about our own lives might be valuable and relevant to any decisions about our future. "David, I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, "but don't you think Frank and I are the best judges of whether our marriage is working and what we want to do about any challenges we might be facing?" "Mom, that's exactly the problem," David responded with obvious frustration. "You and Dad can't see your situation objectively because you're too emotionally involved and too set in your ways to recognize when changes are necessary. That's why families exist, to provide perspective and guidance when elderly relatives need help making decisions that are in their own best interests." David's response revealed his fundamental belief that elderly people automatically lost the capacity for objective self-assessment and appropriate decision-making about their own lives, and that younger family members were not only justified but obligated to override their preferences and make major life decisions on their behalf. But David's intervention in our marriage was only the beginning of the devastating revelation that would unfold at my birthday party. Over the following weeks, he and Sarah had been planning what they clearly viewed as the perfect 70th birthday gift. The legal documents and practical arrangements that would free Frank and me from a marriage they had decided was causing us unnecessary stress and preventing us from achieving the happiness and stability we deserved during our final years. "Mom, we've arranged for a nice birthday celebration at the community center," David announced, 2 weeks before the party. "We've invited your neighbors and some family friends, and we have a special surprise that we think will help you start this new decade of your life with optimism and excitement about the future." The community center venue was itself a perfect representation of David's assumptions about our social status and appropriate celebration standards. Rather than considering locations that might reflect our actual preferences or social connections, he had chosen an institutional setting that was affordable and appropriate for someone in Mom's circumstances. Quote, "The guest list David had assembled reflected his complete misunderstanding of our social connections and community relationships. He had invited immediate neighbors, church acquaintances, and distant relatives, completely unaware that many of Pennsylvania's most prominent business leaders, municipal officials, and industry executives would have gladly attended if they had known about the celebration. But the most significant aspect of David's birthday planning was the special surprise he had prepared. Divorce papers that he intended to present as a thoughtful gift that would solve problems we were apparently too confused or stubborn to address ourselves. Sarah and I have handled all the legal paperwork and filing requirements," David explained proudly. "All you and Dad have to do is sign the documents, and you'll both be free to make your own independent decisions about where and how you want to live, without the complications and stress of trying to maintain a marriage that's clearly not meeting either of your needs anymore." David's presentation of divorce papers as a birthday gift represented the ultimate expression of his paternalistic approach to elderly family management. He had decided that Frank and I needed to be freed from our marriage, had made all the legal arrangements without our consultation or consent, and was presenting the dissolution of our 45-year partnership as a thoughtful present that demonstrated his love and concern for our well-being. The evening of October 15th arrived with David completely confident in his understanding of our situation and his appropriateness in making major life decisions on our behalf. He had no idea that every assumption, every decision, and every condescending intervention over the past 8 months had been carefully documented and analyzed by someone whose business success had been built on accurate assessment of character and integrity under pressure. I arrived at the community center that evening knowing that the next few hours would reveal the truth about power, assumptions, and consequences that would change David's understanding of everything he thought he knew about his own life, his family relationships, and his professional future. The birthday celebration itself was exactly what I had expected based on 8 months of observing David's assumptions about our circumstances and appropriate social arrangements. The modest decorations, institutional venue, and carefully managed guest list all reflected his conviction that elderly people with limited resources deserved simple, economical celebrations that wouldn't strain family budgets or create unrealistic expectations about their social importance or community connections. As the evening progressed, David's excitement and anticipation about his special surprise became increasingly obvious to everyone present. He had clearly convinced himself that the divorce papers he was planning to present would be received as a thoughtful and liberating gift that would improve both Frank's and my happiness and well-being. "Mom, I have something very special for your 70th birthday," David announced, standing before the 40 guests, with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to perform a generous and appropriate family service. "Sarah and I have put a lot of thought and planning into this gift, and we hope it will help you start this new chapter of your life with optimism and excitement about the future." David's presentation was perfect theater, demonstrating his complete conviction that he understood our situation and was making appropriate decisions for elderly parents who needed his guidance and intervention to achieve the happiness and stability they deserved, but were too confused or stubborn to pursue independently. "Happy birthday, Mom," David said, handing me an elegantly wrapped gift bag. "These are divorce papers for you and Dad. We've handled all the legal arrangements and paperwork. All you have to do is sign the documents, and you'll both be free to focus on your own individual happiness without the stress and complications of trying to maintain a marriage that's obviously not working anymore." The silence that followed David's announcement was absolute and profound. 40 guests stared in shock at the birthday gift presentation that had just occurred, clearly struggling to process what they had witnessed and wondering how to respond to such an unprecedented family situation. But I remained calm and composed, having anticipated this moment for months, and prepared carefully for the revelation that would destroy every assumption David had made about power, respect, and the treatment of elderly family members. "David," I said quietly, "before I respond to your gift, I'd like you and everyone here to understand exactly who you've been making decisions for during the past 8 months." Quote, I reached into my purse and withdrew a simple business card, placing it on the table between us exactly as I had planned from the moment David had first begun his paternalistic management of our supposed care needs. "This is my business card, David. My actual business card, showing my position as the founder, majority owner, and chief executive officer of Richardson Industries, the manufacturing company where you work as a mid-level supervisor, completely unaware that the, quote, financially struggling elderly mother you've been managing and controlling actually owns the entire corporation and employs everyone in your department." David stared at the business card for what felt like several minutes, his eyes moving from the company logo to my name to the title that read Eleanor Richardson, founder and CEO, Richardson Industries. The effect was immediate and devastating. David's face went completely white as he began to understand the magnitude of what I was telling him, and the implications for everything he had assumed about our family relationships and his own professional and personal circumstances. "Mom, this says you're the CEO of Richardson Industries," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "That can't be right." Richardson Industries is one of the largest employers in central Pennsylvania. Actually, David, Richardson Industries currently employs 2,347 people across 4 facility locations and has generated $247 million in revenue over the past 3 years, I replied calmly. "We specialize in precision manufacturing, aerospace components, and industrial systems integration for Fortune 500 corporations and government agencies throughout the Northeast and Southeast regions." I reached into my briefcase and began withdrawing additional documents, corporate financial statements, client contracts, industry awards, and professional certifications that documented 42 years of building one of Pennsylvania's most successful manufacturing enterprises. "This is impossible," Sarah gasped from across the room. "You told us you were living on Social Security and Frank's pension. You said you needed help with household expenses and medical bills." "Sarah, I have never needed financial assistance from anyone," I replied, spreading more documents across the table. "My personal net worth exceeds $47 million. And Richardson Industries generates more quarterly revenue than most regional corporations produce annually." I have been testing David's character by allowing him to believe he was managing the affairs of elderly parents who had become dependent on his guidance and financial assistance. The revelation was creating exactly the shock and cognitive dissonance I had anticipated. 40 guests were witnessing the complete destruction of every assumption they had made about the elderly woman whose birthday they were celebrating and the family dynamics they thought they understood. The modest checking account David has been managing contains exactly what he expected to find: the financial records that supported my cover story as an elderly widow living on limited retirement income, I continued. But that account represents approximately 0.3% of my actual liquid assets and has no connection to my business holdings or investment portfolio. David was now reading through the corporate documents with growing horror as he realized the scope of his miscalculation and the implications for his own employment and professional future. David, every instance of inappropriate advice, every demonstration of supposedly amateur knowledge, and every boundary-crossing incident over the past 8 months was strategically designed to test how you treat elderly family members when you believe they lack professional qualifications and social awareness, I explained, retrieving detailed notes I had kept about our conversations and his decisions. "I documented every conversation where you discussed my behavior without asking for my perspective. I recorded every instance where you spoke to me as if I were cognitively impaired rather than professionally qualified. I noted every decision you made about managing my conduct based on your assumptions about my limitations rather than investigation of my actual knowledge and capabilities. The documentation I was presenting showed the systematic nature of the character assessment I had conducted and the comprehensive failure David had demonstrated in treating elderly family members with respect and dignity when he believed they had become dependent on his assistance and guidance. "But the divorce papers," David stammered desperately. "We thought we were helping you and Dad by resolving relationship problems that were causing stress and health concerns." "David, Frank and I have been happily married for 45 years, I replied. "We have normal disagreements and compromises like any long-term partnership. But we have never needed or wanted intervention in our personal relationship from family members who made assumptions about our marriage based on external observations and patronizing assessments of our emotional and cognitive capabilities." I retrieved one final document from my briefcase, a comprehensive analysis of David's employment performance and professional conduct that I had prepared based on his behavior during the testing period. "David, this performance evaluation shows how your treatment of elderly family members reflects character flaws that make you unsuitable for advancement within Richardson Industries' management structure," I announced. "Your paternalistic approach, your failure to consult with people affected by your decisions, and your willingness to override other people's preferences based on your assumptions about their capabilities are precisely the qualities that would make you unreliable and potentially damaging in positions of greater responsibility." The implications of this professional assessment were immediately clear to David. His career advancement, his family's financial security, and his professional reputation within the regional manufacturing industry were all controlled by the woman he had been treating as a helpless burden who needed his management and protection. "Mom, please," David begged, panic clear in his voice. "Can't we discuss this privately? Can't we work something out?" "David, there is nothing to work out," I replied calmly. "You spent 8 months demonstrating how you treat elderly family members when you believe they're powerless and dependent on your generosity. You revealed your character when you thought no one was keeping score, and that character doesn't deserve to benefit from the business relationships and professional opportunities you tried to manage through dismissal and control." But Sarah wasn't finished. In her desperation to salvage the situation, she made the statement that would trigger the most devastating consequence of my entire character assessment. "But Eleanor, we were trying to help you," Sarah protested, her voice rising with frustration and panic. "We thought you were having problems with judgment and realistic self-assessment. We thought we were doing what was best for elderly people who couldn't recognize their own limitations." Quote, "Sarah, when you thought I couldn't defend myself or challenge your decisions," I replied, "you chose social convenience over family respect, control over understanding, and management over acceptance. Those choices have consequences that extend far beyond family relationships into professional and financial realities that will affect every aspect of your lives." But then David made the fatal mistake that would cost him everything. In his desperation and fury at being deceived and outmaneuvered, he lost control completely and revealed the depths of his disrespect and contempt for elderly people he viewed as burdens rather than family members deserving of dignity. "This is insane," David screamed, his face contorted with rage. "You can't just pretend to be helpless for 8 months and then destroy people's lives because they tried to take care of you. That's manipulative and cruel." And then, in front of 40 witnesses, David did something that would seal his fate forever. He grabbed the divorce papers from the table and threw them at me, shouting, "You're just a bitter old woman who can't stand that your family cares enough to make hard decisions for you." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Every person in that community center had witnessed David's complete loss of control and his ultimate expression of disrespect toward an elderly family member who had just revealed herself to be one of Pennsylvania's most successful business leaders. I stood quietly for a moment, allowing the impact of David's behavior to register with everyone present, then reached into my briefcase one final time and withdrew a legal document that I had hoped I wouldn't need to use, but had prepared as the ultimate consequence for the ultimate failure of character. "David," I said calmly, placing the document on the table, "this is your termination notice from Richardson Industries, effective immediately. Your employment is being terminated for cause, including insubordination, unprofessional conduct, and behavior incompatible with our company's values and standards for employee character and integrity. I gathered my materials and walked toward the door, pausing to address the guests who had witnessed the complete destruction of David's assumptions about power, respect, and consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending what has turned out to be a very educational birthday celebration, I announced. I hope everyone has learned something valuable tonight about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent circumstances or your assumptions about their capabilities and worth. As I left the community center, I could hear David's desperate attempts to apologize and negotiate, but the damage was complete and irreversible. 8 months of systematic character testing had revealed fundamental flaws in his integrity and judgment that disqualified him from the respect and opportunities he had believed he was entitled to receive. 6 months later, I received a letter from David that showed he had finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation and was attempting to rebuild his life and character from the complete destruction his assumptions and disrespect had created. "Mom," he wrote, "I have spent every day since that night thinking about what kind of person I had become during those 8 months, and what my behavior revealed about my fundamental attitudes toward elderly people and family relationships. I realize now that I didn't just lose my job and financial security. I lost my relationship with the most accomplished person I've ever known, because I was too arrogant and assumption-driven to see who you really were, or treat you with the respect you deserved, regardless of what I thought your circumstances might be." David went on to explain that the consequences of his behavior had extended far beyond his employment termination. Word of his treatment of me had spread throughout Millbrook's business community, making him unemployable in the regional manufacturing industry and forcing his family to relocate to another state where they could start over without the reputation damage his actions had created. "I understand now that your test wasn't about hidden wealth or secret business success," David continued. "It was about character and respect, and the treatment of elderly people when we think no one important is watching. I failed that test completely, and I'm spending the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the lessons you tried to teach me." David explained that he had enrolled in counseling to address his paternalistic attitudes toward elderly people, had begun volunteering with elder advocacy organizations, and was working to develop the kind of character and integrity that might someday earn back my respect, if not my forgiveness. "I know I can never undo what happened or fully repair the damage my assumptions and disrespect created," he concluded. "But I want you to know that your lesson about dignity, respect, and the danger of assumptions has changed how I think about every relationship and every person I encounter. I hope someday I can prove that I learned something valuable from the most expensive mistake I'll ever make." I responded to David's letter with a carefully considered message about redemption, growth, and the possibility of rebuilding relationships based on genuine respect and understanding rather than assumptions and control. 2 years later, David had demonstrated sufficient character growth and genuine commitment to treating elderly people with dignity that I offered him an entry-level position at Richardson Industries, where he has spent the past 3 years learning about professional excellence, ethical leadership, and the business expertise his mother had been trying to share with him all along. He has proven himself to be a dedicated employee and a changed person who now teaches others about respecting elderly people and never making assumptions about anyone's worth based on age, appearance, or apparent circumstances. Sarah, meanwhile, never recovered from the social and professional consequences of her participation in the systematic disrespect and control we had demonstrated. She divorced David within 6 months of the birthday party revelation, unable to accept responsibility for her role in the family's destruction or commit to the character changes that genuine redemption would have required. As for Frank and me, we celebrated our 47th wedding anniversary last month, still happily married and deeply committed to the partnership that David had tried to dissolve, based on his assumptions about elderly relationships and his qualifications to make major life decisions for people he viewed as burdens, rather than autonomous individuals deserving of respect and dignity. Richardson Industries has continued to grow and expand, now operating in 8 states and employing over 3,200 people. We recently opened our newest division focused specifically on elder advocacy consulting, helping families and organizations develop better approaches to respecting and utilizing the wisdom and experience of older adults rather than managing and controlling them based on assumptions about their limitations and needs. I also established the Richardson Foundation for Elder Dignity, which provides legal support and advocacy services for elderly individuals who experience discrimination, abuse, or disrespect from family members who mistake apparent vulnerability for actual powerlessness and assumptions for truth. The business card I placed on that community center table now hangs framed in my office, along with David's termination notice and the divorce papers he threw at me that evening. They serve as permanent reminders that respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't conditional, and treating people well isn't dependent on what you think they can do for you in return. The woman David thought was a helpless burden who needed to know her place had taught him that assumptions about people's worth based on age, apparent resources, or perceived social status can be the most expensive mistakes you ever make, especially when the person you're underestimating has spent 70 years proving exactly how wrong those assumptions can be. This story is dedicated to every elderly person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or disrespected by people who should have known better. Remember that age brings wisdom, experience, and often accomplishments that younger people can't imagine. The most valuable lesson isn't about hidden wealth or secret success. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of what you think they can or cannot contribute to your life and happiness. And sometimes, the most important tests of character are the ones people don't know they're taking, until it's too late to change the result. The consequences of failing those tests can last a lifetime, but the rewards for passing them include the kind of relationships and respect that make life truly meaningful and successful. David learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it completely. Now he teaches others about the danger of assumptions and the power of treating every person, especially elderly family members, with the dignity, respect, and love they deserve simply because they are human beings whose worth isn't determined by their apparent circumstances or your assessment of their capabilities and contributions. That is the most important lesson of all, and it's available to anyone who chooses to learn it before they discover the devastating consequences of treating people poorly when they think no one important is keeping score. My son David handed me a gift bag at my 70th birthday party and said, "Happy birthday, Mom. These are divorce papers for you and Dad," completely unaware that the helpless old woman he was trying to control was actually the founder and CEO of Richardson Industries, a $200 million manufacturing empire that employed half the town, including the company where he worked as a mid-level supervisor, never knowing that his financially struggling mother owned the entire corporation and had been secretly testing his character for the past 8 months. My name is Eleanor Richardson, and I'm 70 years old. If you had walked into the Millbrook Community Center that warm October evening in our small Pennsylvania town, surrounded by neighbors, friends, and family members celebrating what they believed was just another elderly woman's birthday party, you would have seen exactly what David saw: a frail widow living on a modest pension, dependent on her adult children for financial support and major life decisions, someone whose opinions about her own marriage and future had apparently become irrelevant now that age had supposedly diminished her capacity for independent judgment and self-determination. You would have watched David stand confidently in front of 40 guests, holding that gift bag like he was presenting a thoughtful present, completely convinced that he was doing the right thing for a mother who had clearly lost the ability to make rational decisions about her own life and relationships. His wife Sarah stood beside him, nodding approvingly at what they both believed was a necessary family intervention that would finally resolve the problem of their elderly parents' deteriorating marriage and increasingly burdensome care requirements. You would have seen David's chest puffed out with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was finally taking control of a family situation that had become too complicated for his elderly parents to handle on their own, completely unaware that every conversation, every assumption, and every condescending decision he had made over the past 8 months had been carefully documented by someone with the power to destroy everything he thought he had built for himself and his family. You would have observed a son who had convinced himself that love meant making decisions for people who couldn't make them for themselves, who had decided that respect meant managing elderly parents like children, who needed guidance and protection from their own poor judgment and outdated thinking about modern relationships and financial planning. You might have noticed how he spoke about me to the other guests, using that particular tone that adult children often adopt when discussing elderly relatives they view as burdens, rather than family members deserving of dignity and autonomy. The birthday party itself was a perfect representation of everything wrong with David's understanding of my circumstances and capabilities. He had organized the entire event without consulting me about the guest list, the venue, or even the date, making all decisions based on his assumptions about what would be appropriate for someone in my supposed situation. The decorating was clearly done on a tight budget, reflecting his belief that spending significant money on celebrations for elderly people was wasteful and unnecessary. The guest list revealed David's fundamental misunderstanding of my social connections and professional relationships. He had invited our immediate neighbors, a few church acquaintances, and some distant relatives, completely unaware that many of Austin's most prominent business leaders, municipal officials, and industry executives would have gladly attended if they had known about the celebration. Instead, David had created a gathering that reflected his assumption that my social circle consisted primarily of other elderly people with limited resources and declining influence in community affairs. The venue selection was equally telling. Rather than considering locations that might reflect my actual preferences or social status, David had chosen the community center because it was affordable and, quote, appropriate for someone in Mom's circumstances. The bland institutional setting, with its folding chairs and fluorescent lighting, was perfectly designed to reinforce everyone's assumptions about my financial limitations and social position in the community. But what you couldn't have seen, what you couldn't have imagined, and what you were about to discover in the most shocking way possible, was that every single assumption David had made about my financial situation, my business capabilities, and my need for his guidance and intervention was not just wrong. It was about to cost him everything he had worked for in the most devastating reversal of power and consequences he could never have imagined possible. The helpless widow who supposedly needed her son's protection was actually the woman who signed his paychecks, approved his health insurance, and had the power to determine whether his family's comfortable suburban lifestyle would continue or disappear, with a single business decision that would teach him the most expensive lesson about respect, assumptions, and the treatment of elderly family members he would ever receive in his entire life. To understand how we had reached this point, you need to know about the 8 months of systematic character testing that had brought us to this moment of ultimate revelation. It had all started in February, when my husband Frank had what appeared to be a minor heart episode that led to his hospitalization for observation and treatment. David and Sarah had immediately taken charge of the situation, making decisions about Frank's medical care and our household management, without consulting either of us about our preferences or capabilities. Mom, Dad obviously can't handle the stress of managing your household finances anymore, David had announced during one of his daily visits to the hospital. Sarah and I think it would be best if we took over paying your bills and handling your banking until Dad recovers completely. I had agreed to this arrangement, curious to see how they would handle what they believed was our financial management, completely unaware that they were about to begin managing the personal checking account of someone whose business holdings generated more monthly income than David's annual salary. The modest checking account I allowed them to access contained exactly what they expected to find: the financial records of an elderly couple living on Social Security, pension payments, and limited savings. Over the following weeks, I watched with fascination as David and Sarah conducted their intervention in our family finances. They set up automatic bill payments for our utilities, arranged for grocery delivery services, and even contacted what they believed were our creditors to negotiate payment plans for what they assumed were mounting medical bills and household expenses that had become overwhelming for elderly people on fixed incomes. Mom, we've worked out a budget that should help you and Dad manage your expenses better, Sarah explained during one of her weekly visits. We've identified several areas where you can cut costs and maybe even build up a small emergency fund for future medical expenses. Their budget recommendations were both touching and revealing. They suggested we cancel our cable television service, reduce our grocery expenses by shopping at discount stores, and consider applying for senior citizen assistance programs for utilities and medical care. Every suggestion reflected their absolute conviction that Frank and I were struggling financially and needed their guidance to avoid falling into poverty or losing our home. But what made their financial intervention particularly interesting was how it revealed their attitudes about elderly people's worth and autonomy. They never asked us what we wanted or preferred. They simply made decisions based on their assumptions about what elderly people in our supposed circumstances should need and accept. Their approach was fundamentally paternalistic, treating us like children who couldn't be trusted to understand our own financial situation or make appropriate decisions about our own lives. During this same period, David began involving himself in what he believed were our major household decisions and long-term planning needs. He arranged for contractors to provide estimates for what he considered necessary home repairs and maintenance projects, negotiating prices based on his assumption that we had very limited resources for property improvements. He researched senior living communities and assisted living facilities, collecting brochures and pricing information for what he clearly viewed as our inevitable transition to institutional care. "Mom, I think you and Dad need to start planning for the future," David said during one particularly condescending conversation. "This house is getting too big for you to manage, and the maintenance costs are probably stretching your budget. We should look at some nice senior communities where you could have help with daily activities and not worry about property upkeep." His recommendations were all based on the assumption that Frank and I were becoming increasingly incapable of independent living and would soon need the kind of supervised care that elderly people with limited resources typically required. He researched facilities based on Medicare coverage and modest private pay options, never considering that we might prefer or be able to afford higher-end communities with more amenities and independence options. But David's involvement in our supposed financial and living situation planning revealed something much more disturbing than simple misunderstanding of our circumstances. It showed how he viewed elderly people once he believed they had become dependent on family assistance and guidance. His tone became increasingly patronizing, his decisions more unilateral, and his explanations more simplified, as if age had automatically reduced our ability to understand complex information or make sophisticated choices about our own lives. The most revealing aspect of David's behavior was how he discussed our situation with other family members and friends. I overheard numerous conversations where he described Frank and me as, quote, struggling to manage and needing a lot of help with basic decisions. He presented himself as the dutiful son who had stepped up to take care of elderly parents who could no longer handle their own affairs, earning praise and sympathy from people who admired his dedication to family responsibility. These conversations showed me exactly how David viewed elderly family members once he believed they had lost their independence and capability. We became problems to be managed rather than people to be respected, burdens to be handled rather than family members whose preferences and dignity mattered. His approach was entirely focused on efficiency and control, rather than consultation and respect for our autonomy and experience. By May, David's management of our supposed financial and household situation had expanded into what he clearly viewed as necessary intervention in our marriage and personal relationship. He had observed that Frank and I occasionally disagreed about household decisions and medical care preferences, which David interpreted as evidence that our marriage had become problematic and potentially harmful to both of our well-being and care requirements. "Mom, I'm concerned about the tension between you and Dad," David said during one of his increasingly frequent family meetings. "The stress isn't good for either of you, especially with Dad's heart condition. Maybe you should consider whether this relationship is still working for both of you." This conversation revealed the depth of David's assumptions about elderly marriages and the value of long-term relationships between aging spouses. He seemed to believe that any conflict or disagreement between elderly couples was evidence of fundamental incompatibility that should be resolved through separation, rather than communication and compromise. His approach completely ignored the complexity and history of a 45-year marriage, treating our relationship like a business arrangement that could be dissolved when it became inconvenient or challenging. Over the following months, David became increasingly insistent that Frank and I should consider making some major changes in our living situation and relationship status. He researched divorce procedures for elderly couples, investigated the division of limited assets, and even consulted with attorneys about the legal process for what he assumed would be a simple dissolution of a marriage between two people with minimal financial resources and straightforward care needs. "Mom, I've talked to a lawyer about how divorce works for people in your situation," David announced during a family dinner in August. "It's actually pretty straightforward when there aren't significant assets or complicated financial arrangements to divide. You and Dad could both be much happier living independently or in separate care facilities, where you wouldn't have to deal with the stress of managing a relationship that's clearly not working anymore." This conversation was particularly revealing because it showed how completely David had misunderstood both our financial situation and our relationship dynamics. He was planning our divorce based on his assumption that we were an elderly couple with limited resources and simple care needs, completely unaware that he was discussing the dissolution of a marriage between two people whose combined net worth exceeded $200 million. And whose business partnership had built one of the most successful manufacturing enterprises in central Pennsylvania. But even more importantly, David's approach to our marriage revealed his fundamental attitude about elderly people's right to make their own decisions about their most personal and important relationships. He never asked us what we wanted, never inquired about our feelings or preferences, and never considered that we might have insights about our own relationship that he couldn't possibly understand from his external observations and assumptions. By September, David had convinced himself that Frank and I were incapable of recognizing that our marriage had become problematic for both of our health and happiness. He decided that the kindest and most responsible action would be to take control of the situation and make the decision for us, presenting divorce as a gift that would free us from a relationship we were apparently too confused or stubborn to end ourselves. Sarah and I have decided that the best birthday present we could give you is the opportunity to start fresh and focus on your own happiness and health, David explained as he prepared for my birthday party. We've handled all the paperwork and legal arrangements. All you have to do is sign the documents, and you'll be free to make your own choices about where and how you want to live. This statement revealed everything I needed to know about David's character and his approach to treating elderly family members when he believed they had become dependent on his guidance and decision-making. He viewed our autonomy as something he could grant or withhold based on his assessment of our capabilities and needs. He treated our most important personal decisions as matters for his management and control, rather than respecting our right to make our own choices about our own lives. The birthday party itself was the perfect culmination of 8 months of condescending assumptions and paternalistic decision-making. David had organized the entire event as a demonstration of his control over our social and personal lives, creating a celebration that reflected his beliefs about what elderly people in our supposed circumstances deserved and should expect from their family and community relationships. But what David didn't realize was that every conversation, every assumption, and every decision he had made during those 8 months had been carefully observed and documented by someone who was about to reveal the most devastating truth about power, respect, and the treatment of elderly family members that he would ever encounter in his entire life. The gift bag he presented to me that evening contained divorce papers that he believed would solve problems that existed only in his imagination, prepared by lawyers who had no idea they were handling the personal affairs of one of Pennsylvania's most successful business owners, paid for with money that David had earned working for a company owned by the woman whose life he was trying to manage and control. As I stood in that community center, surrounded by neighbors and relatives who had no idea what they were about to witness, holding divorce papers that represented the culmination of my son's complete misunderstanding of my circumstances, capabilities, and character, I knew that the moment had arrived to reveal the truth about assumptions, respect, and consequences that would change everyone's understanding of who held the real power in our family relationships. But before I opened that gift bag and allowed David to fully reveal his character in front of 40 witnesses, I wanted to savor one final moment of observing how completely convinced he was that he understood my situation and was making appropriate decisions for someone whose capabilities and preferences had become irrelevant due to age and apparent dependence on his guidance and protection. Because in just a few minutes, David was going to discover that the, quote, helpless elderly mother he had been managing and controlling was actually the woman who owned the company where he worked, controlled the assets he thought he was helping to manage, and possessed the power to teach him the most expensive lesson about respect and dignity that any son could ever receive from a mother he had completely underestimated and fundamentally disrespected. The systematic character testing that would eventually lead to David's devastating humiliation at my birthday party had begun 8 months earlier with what appeared to be a simple medical emergency, but was actually the perfect opportunity to observe how my son treated elderly family members when he believed they had become vulnerable and dependent on his guidance and protection. It was a cold February morning when Frank complained of chest pains and shortness of breath during breakfast. As a precautionary measure, I had insisted we go to Millbrook General Hospital for evaluation, knowing that Frank's symptoms were likely related to a minor respiratory infection, but understanding that any cardiac concerns in a 72-year-old man would require comprehensive testing and observation. David arrived at the hospital within an hour of my call, immediately taking charge of the situation, with an efficiency and authority that revealed his assumptions about elderly people's capacity to handle medical emergencies and make appropriate healthcare decisions under pressure. "Mom, don't worry about anything," David announced as he strode into Frank's hospital room, where I was calmly discussing treatment options with the attending physician. "I'll handle all the medical coordination and insurance paperwork. You just focus on supporting Dad and let me manage the complicated stuff." This initial response established the pattern that would characterize David's behavior throughout the testing period. He had automatically assumed that Frank's hospitalization had overwhelmed my ability to understand complex medical information, coordinate with healthcare providers, and make appropriate decisions about treatment options and care management. His offer to, quote, handle the complicated stuff revealed his belief that age had diminished my cognitive capacity and decision-making abilities to the point where I needed his intervention and management. But what made David's response particularly interesting from a character assessment perspective was how quickly he had transitioned from offering assistance to assuming control. Within the first hour of his arrival, he had positioned himself as the primary decision-maker and information coordinator for Frank's care, speaking directly with doctors and nursing staff as if I were simply a supportive family member rather than Frank's spouse and medical decision-making partner. "Dr. Martinez, I'm Frank's son David," he introduced himself to Frank's cardiologist. "I'll be coordinating his care and handling all the discharge planning. My parents are getting up in years, and medical situations like this can be pretty overwhelming for elderly people to manage on their own." Dr. Martinez glanced at me with obvious confusion, clearly wondering why David was presenting himself as the primary care coordinator when I had been competently managing Frank's medical information and treatment discussions since our arrival. But rather than challenging David's assumption of authority, I decided to observe how far he would take his management role and what it would reveal about his fundamental attitudes toward elderly people's capabilities and autonomy. Over the following 3 days of Frank's hospitalization, David demonstrated a comprehensive approach to managing what he believed were our overwhelming medical and logistical challenges. He arranged for meal deliveries to our home, organized transportation for my hospital visits, coordinated with Frank's employer about medical leave arrangements, and even contacted our insurance company to verify coverage details and pre-authorization requirements. Each of these interventions was both helpful and revealing. David's efficiency and attention to detail showed genuine care and concern for our well-being, but his approach also demonstrated his complete conviction that Frank's medical situation had exceeded our ability to manage complex coordination tasks and decision-making responsibilities. He never asked whether we needed his assistance with these arrangements. He simply assumed that elderly people facing medical challenges would naturally require comprehensive management from younger family members with better organizational skills and understanding of modern healthcare systems. But the most significant aspect of David's hospital management approach was how it revealed his attitudes about elderly people's right to privacy and autonomous decision-making during medical situations. He had requested access to Frank's medical records, asked to be included in all physician consultations, and even suggested that he should be listed as Frank's healthcare proxy, despite the fact that I was Frank's spouse and had been successfully managing medical decisions for both of us for decades. "Mom, I think it would be smart to update Dad's healthcare directives while we're dealing with this situation," David suggested during one of our conversations in Frank's hospital room. "You're both getting older, and medical decisions are becoming more complicated. It might be helpful to have someone younger involved in the process who can understand all the technical information and treatment options." This suggestion revealed David's assumption that aging automatically reduced people's capacity to understand medical information and make appropriate healthcare decisions, even when those people had been successfully managing their own medical care without assistance or confusion. His recommendation that we needed someone younger to help with medical decision-making showed his belief that cognitive capacity was primarily determined by age rather than individual capability, experience, and competence. More troubling was David's implied suggestion that I was no longer qualified to serve as Frank's healthcare decision-maker simply because of my age, despite 45 years of partnership in making medical and personal decisions together. His approach suggested that elderly spouses automatically became less reliable and capable healthcare advocates simply because they shared the same age-related vulnerabilities as their partners. During Frank's recovery period, David's management approach expanded beyond medical coordination into what he clearly viewed as necessary intervention in our household management and daily living arrangements. He had observed that Frank's hospitalization had left me alone in our house for several days, which David interpreted as evidence that our living situation had become potentially problematic for elderly people who might face future medical emergencies or care challenges. "Mom, I'm concerned about you and Dad managing this big house if one of you gets sick again," David announced during one of his daily check-in visits. "Have you thought about what would happen if Dad needed extended care, or if you had a medical emergency when he wasn't able to help you?" This conversation revealed David's assumption that Frank's minor cardiac episode represented the beginning of a decline in our independence and self-sufficiency that would inevitably require family intervention and possibly alternative living arrangements. He seemed to believe that any medical situation involving elderly people was evidence of increasing frailty and diminishing capacity rather than a normal healthcare event that could be managed and resolved without fundamental changes to our lifestyle and autonomy. But what made David's concerns about our living situation particularly revealing was how he had framed the discussion in terms of problems and risks, rather than exploring what support or assistance might be helpful while preserving our independence and dignity. His approach was focused on identifying what he viewed as our emerging limitations, rather than understanding our preferences and capabilities, or asking what we thought would be most helpful and appropriate for our situation. "I've been researching some options for senior living communities in the area," David continued. "There are some really nice places that provide different levels of support while still allowing independence. I think you and Dad should at least visit a few facilities to understand what's available if you need more assistance in the future." David's research into senior living options revealed his assumption that Frank's hospitalization was a warning sign of inevitable decline that required proactive planning for institutional care, rather than an isolated medical event that could be managed through appropriate healthcare follow-up and preventative measures. His suggestion that we should visit facilities to understand what's available showed his belief that alternative living arrangements were becoming inevitable, rather than simply one option among many for managing future healthcare needs. More significantly, David's approach to discussing our housing and care options revealed his fundamental attitude about elderly people's decision-making capacity and the appropriate role of adult children in managing their parents' life choices. He presented senior living research as information we needed to consider, rather than asking whether we were interested in exploring alternative arrangements or what our own preferences and concerns might be about our current living situation. The first major anomaly that would eventually contribute to David's devastating humiliation occurred during a family meeting he had organized to discuss Frank's discharge planning and our, quote, long-term care coordination needs. David had prepared what he clearly viewed as a comprehensive assessment of our situation and a set of recommendations for managing the healthcare and logistical challenges that he believed Frank's cardiac episode had revealed. "I've put together some information about the support services and care options that might be helpful for you and Dad going forward," David announced, spreading out brochures and printed materials across our dining room table. "I want to make sure you understand all the resources available for seniors in your situation." The materials David had assembled reflected his thorough research into senior services, healthcare coordination programs, and assisted living facilities, but they also revealed his complete assumption that we needed comprehensive guidance about resources and options that were supposedly beyond our own knowledge and research capabilities. His presentation suggested that elderly people naturally required education and guidance about available services, rather than simply information and support for exploring options they were perfectly capable of investigating and evaluating themselves. But as David began explaining the various programs and services he had researched, I decided to test his reaction to unexpected expertise and knowledge that contradicted his assumptions about elderly people's understanding of complex systems and available resources. "David, this is very thoughtful research," I began, examining the materials he had prepared. "But I notice you focused primarily on Medicare-covered services and programs designed for seniors with limited financial resources. Have you considered the private care coordination services and concierge healthcare programs that might provide more personalized attention and flexibility for people who can afford premium options? David paused in his presentation, clearly surprised by my reference to healthcare services and options that went beyond the basic senior programs he had researched. His expression showed confusion about how I had acquired knowledge of premium healthcare services that were supposedly beyond the typical experience and resources of elderly people in our apparent circumstances. "Mom, I'm not sure what you mean by concierge healthcare programs," David replied carefully. "The services I've researched are the standard options available through our insurance and the county senior services department. I think these programs will provide everything you need for managing Dad's follow-up care and any future medical situations." "Well, dear," I continued, maintaining my innocent grandmother persona while demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible given David's assumptions about our financial situation, concierge healthcare services provide dedicated physicians and care coordinators who are available 24 hours a day for immediate consultation and house calls. The annual membership fees are usually between $15,000 and $30,000 per person, but the personalized attention and coordination can be invaluable for managing complex medical situations without the delays and limitations of traditional healthcare systems. The silence that followed my explanation was profound and uncomfortable. David was clearly struggling to process how his supposedly financially limited elderly mother had acquired detailed knowledge about premium healthcare services that cost more annually than many people's discretionary income, and how I could discuss these options as if they were realistic considerations rather than theoretical luxuries completely beyond our circumstances and resources. "Mom," David said slowly, "where did you learn about concierge healthcare services? Those programs are pretty expensive and specialized. They're not typically something that they're usually for people with substantial financial resources who need premium healthcare management." "Oh, I've been reading about different healthcare options online," I replied casually, as if extensive research into expensive medical services was a normal hobby for elderly people living on limited incomes. "When you get to be my age, you want to understand all the possibilities for managing healthcare needs, even if some options might be more expensive than others." But I wasn't finished demonstrating knowledge that would challenge David's assumptions about my capabilities and resources. As he continued reviewing his prepared materials about senior services and care coordination, I began asking questions that revealed familiarity with healthcare administration, insurance systems, and care management approaches that went far beyond casual consumer research. "David, have you considered the implications of Medicare Supplement Plan F versus Plan G for managing Dad's ongoing cardiac monitoring requirements?" I asked, using technical insurance terminology that should have been completely unfamiliar to someone in my supposed circumstances. The coverage differences could be significant for preventative screenings and specialist consultations, especially if Dad needs regular cardiology follow-up visits. David stared at me with obvious bewilderment. "Mom, how do you know about different Medicare supplement plans? That's pretty technical insurance information that most people don't research unless they're working with professional advisors or have specific expertise in healthcare benefits." "Well, sweetheart, when you're managing healthcare decisions for elderly people, you learn to research insurance options carefully," I replied, continuing to demonstrate expertise that contradicted his assumptions while maintaining my cover story. "I've been comparing the cost-benefit analysis of different supplement plans and coordinating with Frank's primary care physician about the most efficient ways to structure his ongoing monitoring and prevention protocols." The terminology I was using, cost-benefit analysis, monitoring protocols, prevention strategies, was clearly beyond what David expected from elderly healthcare consumers, especially those he believed were living on limited resources and depending on family assistance for managing complex medical decisions. But the most significant moment of the first anomaly occurred when David began discussing what he viewed as necessary changes to our financial management and household coordination in light of Frank's medical situation and our apparent need for ongoing family assistance and oversight. "Mom, I think this medical situation has shown that you and Dad might need some help managing your finances and household expenses going forward," David announced. "Medical bills can get complicated, and coordinating insurance payments and provider billing can be overwhelming for people who aren't familiar with modern healthcare administration systems." "That's very considerate, David," I replied, What kind of financial management assistance are you thinking about? Well, I could take over paying your monthly bills and coordinating with your insurance company for Dad's medical expenses. Sarah and I have experience with healthcare billing and insurance claims, and we could probably negotiate better payment arrangements and catch any billing errors that might slip by if you're trying to manage everything yourselves. Quote, this offer revealed David's assumption that Frank's hospitalization had demonstrated our inability to handle complex financial coordination and that we needed younger family members to manage our healthcare expenses and insurance relationships. His suggestion that we weren't familiar with modern healthcare administration systems showed his belief that elderly people naturally lacked the cognitive flexibility and technical knowledge to navigate contemporary medical billing and insurance processes. But David's offer also provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate financial sophistication and healthcare management expertise that would be impossible to explain based on his assumptions about our background and resources. David, I appreciate the offer, but I think Frank and I have been managing our healthcare finances quite effectively, I replied. We've established relationships with preferred provider networks, negotiated payment schedules that optimize our cash flow management, and even set up health savings account strategies that provide tax advantages for our ongoing medical expenses. David's expression showed complete confusion about my reference to financial strategies and healthcare management approaches that required sophisticated knowledge of tax law, insurance systems, and cash flow optimization techniques. Mom, what do you mean by health savings account strategies and cash flow optimization? David asked. Those sound like pretty advanced financial planning concepts that usually require professional advice and significant financial resources to implement effectively. Well, dear, I continued, enjoying his growing bewilderment, when you're managing healthcare expenses for elderly people, you learn to coordinate timing of medical procedures with insurance benefit periods, optimize deductible strategies across calendar years, and structure payments to maximize the tax benefits of medical expense deductions. We've also established credit relationships with medical providers that allow us to coordinate payment schedules with our investment portfolio distributions to minimize the impact on our overall financial planning. Quote, the terminology I was using, investment portfolio distributions, tax optimization strategies, credit relationships with providers, was completely inconsistent with David's assumptions about elderly people living on fixed incomes and depending on Social Security and pension benefits for their financial security. Mom, David said carefully, it sounds like you and Dad have some pretty sophisticated financial planning arrangements. Where did you learn about investment portfolio management and tax optimization strategies? Those are usually areas that require professional financial advisory services or significant personal experience with complex financial management. This question provided me with the perfect opportunity to plant the first major seed of doubt about his assumptions, while maintaining my cover story and testing his willingness to investigate contradictory evidence, rather than simply dismissing information that challenged his preconceptions. Oh, sweetheart, you learn all sorts of things when you're managing retirement finances and healthcare planning, I replied innocently. Frank and I have had to become quite knowledgeable about financial management over the years, especially with medical expenses and long-term care planning. When you're living on retirement income, you have to be very strategic about managing your resources and maximizing the efficiency of your spending and savings. But David's response revealed his fundamental character flaw and the approach he would take throughout the testing period when confronted with evidence that contradicted his assumptions about my capabilities and circumstances. Rather than investigating further or reconsidering his assumptions about our financial situation, David chose to rationalize and dismiss the expertise I had demonstrated, treating it as coincidental knowledge or lucky research, rather than evidence that his basic understanding of our circumstances might be fundamentally incorrect. That's really impressive research, Mom, David said patronizingly. You and Dad have obviously been doing a lot of reading about financial planning and healthcare management. But I still think it would be helpful to have some family assistance with coordinating the practical aspects of Dad's care and making sure nothing important gets overlooked during his recovery period. Quote, this response revealed everything I needed to know about David's character and his approach to processing information that challenged his assumptions about elderly people's capabilities. Rather than investigating whether his fundamental understanding of our situation might be wrong, he had chosen to maintain his assumptions and treat my expertise as amateur research, rather than professional knowledge. David's dismissive response to the first anomaly established the pattern that would characterize his behavior throughout the 8-month testing period. When confronted with evidence of knowledge, capabilities, or resources that contradicted his assumptions about elderly people's limitations, he would rationalize and dismiss rather than investigate and reconsider. This approach revealed fundamental character flaws that would eventually cost him everything he thought he had built for himself and his family. His unwillingness to question his assumptions, his paternalistic attitude toward elderly family members, and his preference for control over understanding would eventually be exposed in the most devastating and expensive lesson about respect and assumptions that any son could ever receive from a mother he had completely underestimated. But for now, David remained completely convinced that he understood our situation and was providing appropriate assistance and guidance to elderly parents who needed his intervention and management. He had no idea that every assumption, every decision, and every dismissive response was being carefully documented by someone whose business success had been built on precisely the kind of character assessment and strategic thinking that he was failing to demonstrate in his treatment of family members he believed were powerless and dependent on his generosity and protection. The first anomaly had been successfully planted, revealing David's character while beginning the process that would ultimately lead to his complete humiliation and the most expensive mistake of his entire life. But this was only the beginning of the systematic testing that would expose every flaw in his assumptions about power, respect, and the treatment of elderly family members who appeared to need his guidance and control. The woman he was treating as a confused and financially limited elderly mother was actually conducting the most comprehensive character assessment of his integrity, judgment, and values that he could ever imagine. And so far, he was failing every test with assumptions and responses that would soon cost him everything he thought he understood about his own life and his family's future security and success. The second major anomaly that would contribute to David's eventual devastation occurred 6 weeks after Frank's discharge from the hospital, when what appeared to be a simple household maintenance issue provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate professional-level expertise that should have been impossible for someone in my supposedly limited circumstances to possess. It was mid-March when our home's heating system began making unusual noises and showing signs of inefficient operation that suggested potential equipment failure or maintenance problems. For most homeowners, this would have been a straightforward matter of calling a repair service and accepting whatever diagnosis and recommendations the technicians provided. But for someone with my actual background in industrial operations and equipment management, a malfunctioning HVAC system presented an opportunity to demonstrate technical knowledge that would completely contradict David's assumptions about elderly people's understanding of complex mechanical systems and maintenance requirements. David had immediately offered to handle the heating system situation when I mentioned the unusual noises during one of our weekly family dinners, once again positioning himself as the family member responsible for managing complicated household issues that might overwhelm elderly people's problem-solving capabilities and technical understanding. "Mom, don't worry about the heating problems," David announced with the same authoritative tone he had used during Frank's medical situation. "I'll call some repair companies and get estimates for whatever work needs to be done. Heating system repairs can be expensive, and these companies sometimes try to oversell unnecessary services to elderly customers who don't understand the technical details." This response revealed David's assumption that elderly homeowners were naturally vulnerable to exploitation by service providers because of their limited understanding of mechanical systems and maintenance requirements. His offer to handle the heating situation showed his belief that age automatically reduced people's ability to evaluate technical information, understand repair recommendations, and make appropriate decisions about home maintenance investments. But David's approach also revealed deeper assumptions about elderly people's financial vulnerability and their need for protection from service providers who might take advantage of their supposed ignorance and limited resources. His concern about companies overselling unnecessary services suggested his belief that Frank and I were living on such restricted budgets that any significant home repair expense would create financial hardship requiring careful management and cost control. "That's very thoughtful, David," I replied, "but I think I'd like to evaluate the heating system situation myself before we bring in outside contractors. Sometimes these issues can be diagnosed and resolved more efficiently with a systematic approach to troubleshooting the underlying mechanical problems." David looked puzzled by my suggestion that I was capable of diagnosing heating system problems or understanding the technical aspects of HVAC equipment operation and maintenance requirements. Mom, heating systems are pretty complicated, David replied carefully. It's usually better to have professional technicians evaluate equipment problems rather than trying to troubleshoot mechanical issues that require specialized knowledge and diagnostic tools. This response provided me with the perfect opening to begin demonstrating expertise that would challenge every assumption David had made about my technical capabilities and professional background. Well, sweetheart, let me take a look at the system operation and see if I can identify the specific performance issues before we schedule service calls, I said, heading toward our basement utility room with David following behind, clearly curious about what his supposedly non-technical elderly mother thought she could accomplish with complex heating equipment. What David observed over the next hour would become one of the most significant anomalies in his understanding of my capabilities and background, though his response would reveal the same character flaws and dismissive approach that had characterized his reaction to my healthcare and financial expertise during Frank's hospitalization. I began my evaluation of our heating system with a systematic diagnostic approach that immediately demonstrated familiarity with HVAC equipment operation, maintenance protocols, and performance optimization techniques that went far beyond casual homeowner knowledge or amateur troubleshooting capabilities. David, I'm going to check the combustion efficiency ratings first, I announced, examining the boiler's control panel and diagnostic displays with professional competence that clearly surprised him. The unusual noises suggest possible issues with the heat exchanger or circulation pump operation, but we need to establish baseline performance metrics before identifying specific component problems. The terminology I was using, combustion efficiency ratings, heat exchanger diagnostics, circulation pump performance metrics, was clearly beyond what David expected from elderly homeowners, especially those he believed were living on limited incomes and depending on family assistance for managing complex household maintenance decisions. Mom, how do you know about combustion efficiency and heat exchanger diagnostics? David asked, obviously bewildered by my technical vocabulary and systematic approach to equipment evaluation. Oh, you learn about these things when you're responsible for maintaining heating systems, I replied casually, while using diagnostic tools and measurement equipment that I had retrieved from our utility room storage area. When you own a home for 40 years, you develop knowledge about mechanical systems and equipment maintenance requirements. But my explanation became increasingly difficult to maintain as I continued demonstrating expertise that required professional training and hands-on experience with industrial heating equipment rather than casual homeowner maintenance knowledge. The problem appears to be related to improper combustion air mixture ratios, I announced after completing my diagnostic evaluation. The system is operating at approximately 78% efficiency instead of the optimal 85 to 92% range, which suggests either air intake obstruction or fuel delivery irregularities affecting the combustion process. David stared at me with complete confusion as I adjusted control settings and tested system responses with the competence of someone who had extensive experience with HVAC equipment operation and maintenance procedures. Mom, that sounds like really technical diagnostic information, David said slowly. How do you know about combustion air ratios and efficiency percentages? That kind of knowledge usually requires professional training in heating system operation and maintenance. Quote, Well, dear, I continued, enjoying his growing bewilderment while maintaining my innocent homeowner persona, I've been reading technical manuals and troubleshooting guides for our heating system. When you want to maintain equipment properly and avoid expensive repair bills, you learn to understand the operational parameters and performance specifications. But I wasn't finished demonstrating knowledge that would completely contradict David's assumptions about my technical background and capabilities. As I continued my diagnostic work, I began discussing equipment maintenance strategies and performance optimization techniques that revealed familiarity with industrial heating systems and commercial HVAC operations. David, I think we should consider upgrading to a high-efficiency condensing boiler system with variable-speed circulation pumps and zone control capabilities, I suggested, using technical terminology that should have been completely unfamiliar to someone in my supposed circumstances. The initial investment would be approximately $15,000 to $20,000, but the energy savings and maintenance cost reductions would provide payback within 4 to 5 years. Plus, we'd get federal tax credits for high-efficiency equipment installations. The silence that followed this recommendation was profound and uncomfortable. David was clearly struggling to process how his supposedly financially limited elderly mother was casually discussing $20,000 home improvement investments and calculating payback periods for equipment upgrades that required sophisticated understanding of energy costs, tax incentives, and long-term financial planning. "Mom," David said carefully, "a $20,000 heating system upgrade is a pretty significant investment. Are you sure that's something you and Dad can afford right now? And how do you know about federal tax credits and payback calculations for heating equipment?" This question provided me with another opportunity to demonstrate financial sophistication and technical knowledge that would be impossible to explain based on David's assumptions about our resources and background. "Well, sweetheart, I've been analyzing our household energy costs and equipment replacement strategies as part of our long-term financial planning," I replied, maintaining my casual tone while providing information that revealed extensive knowledge of home improvement financing and tax optimization strategies. "We've established a home maintenance and upgrade budget that allows for major system replacements and efficiency improvements as part of our property value enhancement and operating cost reduction program." The terminology I was using, energy cost analysis, equipment replacement strategies, property value enhancement programs, was completely inconsistent with David's assumptions about elderly people living on fixed incomes and managing limited household budgets with careful cost control and minimal discretionary spending. "Mom, that sounds like pretty sophisticated financial and technical planning," David replied, his confusion obvious. "Where did you learn about energy analysis and property value enhancement strategies? Those are usually areas that require professional consultation or significant experience with real estate investment and energy management." But before I could respond to David's question, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Frank, who had been shopping for replacement parts and supplies for our heating system maintenance project. What Frank brought home would create an even more significant anomaly in David's understanding of our capabilities and resources. "Eleanor, I found the high-efficiency circulation pump and the programmable zone control system you requested," Frank announced, carrying several boxes of equipment that clearly represented a substantial investment in professional-grade HVAC components. The supplier said these are the same components they install in commercial facilities and high-end residential applications. David stared at the equipment boxes with obvious shock, clearly trying to process how his supposedly financially struggling elderly parents had casually purchased what appeared to be several $1,000s worth of professional heating system components. "Dad, how much did this equipment cost?" David asked, his voice showing the strain of trying to reconcile these purchases with his assumptions about our financial limitations. "About $3,200 for the circulation pump system and zone controls," Frank replied casually, as if spending over $3,000 on heating equipment was a routine household expense, rather than a major financial decision for people living on limited retirement incomes. Eleanor wanted to upgrade to variable speed operation and programmable temperature management for optimal efficiency and comfort control. Quote, "The casual way Frank discussed this significant expenditure, combined with my technical knowledge about equipment specifications and installation requirements, created cognitive dissonance that David was clearly struggling to resolve within his existing assumptions about our circumstances and capabilities." "But Frank," David said carefully, "spending $3,200 on heating equipment is a pretty major expense. Are you sure this is the best use of your resources right now, especially with the medical bills from your recent hospitalization?" Frank's response would provide another piece of evidence that our financial situation was completely different from what David had assumed, though once again David would choose to rationalize rather than investigate the contradictions he was observing. "David, the medical expenses weren't a problem," Frank replied matter-of-factly. "Our healthcare coverage and financial planning handled those costs without any impact on our household budget or equipment upgrade plans. Eleanor has set up our financial management systems to accommodate medical expenses and home maintenance investments without disrupting our long-term spending and saving strategies." This statement revealed not only that Frank's hospitalization hadn't created the financial strain David had assumed, but also that I was apparently responsible for, quote, "financial management systems and long-term spending and saving strategies that suggested sophisticated financial planning and substantial resources rather than the careful budget management that elderly people on fixed incomes typically required. But David's response to these financial revelations would demonstrate the same character flaws and dismissive approach that had characterized his reaction to my healthcare expertise during Frank's hospitalization. Rather than investigating whether his assumptions about our financial situation might be fundamentally wrong, he chose to rationalize and minimize the evidence he was observing. "That's great that you have good insurance coverage, Dad," David said, though his tone suggested confusion about how our supposed Medicare and pension benefits could provide such comprehensive financial protection. "But I'm still concerned about whether major expenses like heating system upgrades are the best financial decisions for people in your situation." Quote, This response revealed David's unwillingness to reconsider his fundamental assumptions about our situation, even when confronted with clear evidence that our financial resources and capabilities were completely different from what he had believed. His continued references to people in your situation showed his commitment to maintaining his assumptions rather than investigating the contradictory evidence he was observing. But the most significant aspect of the second anomaly occurred when I began the actual installation and configuration of the new heating system components, demonstrating hands-on technical skills and professional competence that would be impossible for someone without extensive industrial equipment experience to possess. "David, would you like to help me with the circulation pump installation?" I offered, assembling the tools and equipment needed for what would clearly be a complex mechanical and electrical project. This will involve some pipe fitting, electrical connections, and system programming, but it's a good opportunity to learn about HVAC equipment operation and maintenance procedures. David accepted my invitation, clearly curious about what his supposedly non-technical elderly mother thought she could accomplish with professional-grade heating equipment installation and configuration. What he observed over the next several hours would completely contradict every assumption he had made about elderly people's technical capabilities and my personal background and experience. I began the installation project with systematic preparation and professional organization that immediately demonstrated familiarity with complex mechanical projects and industrial equipment procedures. I had laid out tools, organized components, and prepared installation materials with the efficiency and attention to detail that characterized someone with extensive hands-on experience managing technical projects and equipment installations. "First, we need to shut down the system and drain the circulation loops," I announced, operating valves and controls with confidence that showed intimate knowledge of heating system operation and maintenance procedures. "Then we'll disconnect the existing pump assembly and modify the piping configuration to accommodate the new variable speed equipment and zone control integration." Quote, "The technical procedures I was following, combined with my obvious familiarity with piping systems, electrical connections, and equipment configuration, demonstrated competence that required professional training and extensive hands-on experience rather than casual homeowner maintenance knowledge." "Mom, how do you know so much about heating system installation and electrical work?" David asked as he watched me make pipe connections and wire electrical controls with professional competence. "This looks like the kind of work that usually requires licensed contractors and specialized training." "Well, sweetheart, you learn these skills when you're responsible for maintaining mechanical systems," I replied, while programming the new control system with technical expertise that clearly amazed David. When you understand the operational principles and have the right tools and equipment, most installation and maintenance work is just systematic application of technical knowledge and careful attention to safety procedures. But my explanation was becoming increasingly implausible as I continued demonstrating skills that required professional training and extensive experience with industrial mechanical systems. The programming procedures I was using for the new control system involved technical knowledge of HVAC system integration, temperature management protocols, and energy optimization strategies that went far beyond homeowner-level understanding of heating equipment operation. "David, I'm setting up zone control programming that will optimize heating efficiency based on occupancy patterns, outside temperature conditions, and thermal load variations throughout the house," I explained, using control system interfaces with the competence of someone who had extensive experience with commercial building automation and energy management systems. "The variable speed pump will adjust circulation rates automatically based on heating demand, which should reduce our energy consumption by approximately 20 to 25%, while improving comfort control and system reliability." The technical sophistication of the system I was configuring, combined with my obvious expertise in programming and optimization procedures, represented capabilities that would be impossible for someone without professional experience in commercial HVAC systems and building energy management to possess. "Mom, this programming work looks really advanced," David observed, clearly struggling to understand how I had acquired such sophisticated technical knowledge and hands-on experience. "The control systems and optimization strategies you're describing sound like something that would be used in commercial buildings or industrial facilities rather than residential applications." This observation provided me with the perfect opportunity to plant another seed of doubt about David's assumptions, while testing his willingness to investigate contradictory evidence rather than dismissing information that challenged his preconceptions about my background and capabilities. "Oh, you're right that these are commercial-grade systems, David," I replied casually. "I prefer to use professional equipment and installation procedures, rather than residential-grade components that might not provide optimal performance and reliability. When you understand system operation and have access to commercial suppliers, you can often get better equipment and achieve superior results compared to standard residential installations." David's expression showed complete bewilderment at my casual reference to, quote, "commercial suppliers and professional equipment access" that suggested business relationships and industry connections completely inconsistent with his assumptions about retired elderly homeowners with limited resources and technical knowledge. "Mom, how do you have access to commercial suppliers and professional-grade equipment?" David asked. "Those kinds of business relationships usually require professional credentials or industry connections that aren't typically available to residential customers." This question provided me with another opportunity to demonstrate knowledge and relationships that contradicted David's assumptions, while maintaining my cover story and observing his response to increasingly implausible explanations. "Well, dear, when you've been managing property maintenance and mechanical systems for many years, you develop relationships with suppliers and contractors who provide access to professional equipment and technical support," I replied, enjoying David's growing confusion while providing just enough information to challenge his assumptions without revealing the full scope of my actual business background and industry connections. But David's response to the second anomaly would once again reveal his fundamental character flaws and his unwillingness to investigate evidence that contradicted his established assumptions about elderly people's capabilities and circumstances. Rather than recognizing that my technical knowledge, financial resources, and industry connections might indicate a completely different background and situation than he had assumed, David chose to rationalize and dismiss the evidence he had observed, treating my expertise as exceptional amateur knowledge rather than professional competence that suggested fundamental errors in his understanding of my circumstances. "That's really impressive, Mom," David said patronizingly. "You and Dad have obviously learned a lot about home maintenance and equipment installation over the years. But I'm still concerned about whether these kinds of major projects and expenses are appropriate for people in your situation, especially if something goes wrong with the installation, or if you need professional service support in the future." This response revealed everything I needed to know about David's character and his approach to processing information that challenged his assumptions about elderly family members. Rather than investigating or reconsidering his beliefs about our capabilities and resources, he had chosen to maintain his paternalistic attitude and treat my demonstrated expertise as potentially problematic behavior that required his guidance and oversight. The second anomaly had been successfully planted, revealing once again that David preferred control and assumption over curiosity and investigation, when confronted with evidence that contradicted his beliefs about elderly people's limitations and his own role as their manager and protector. The woman he was treating as a technically incompetent elderly homeowner was actually someone whose industrial experience and mechanical expertise far exceeded his own, and whose business relationships and technical knowledge represented capabilities he couldn't even imagine. But rather than recognizing these contradictions as evidence that his fundamental assumptions might be wrong, David had chosen to maintain his dismissive attitude and continue treating me as someone who needed his protection from her own poor judgment and inappropriate ambitions. The systematic character testing was proceeding exactly as planned, with each anomaly revealing deeper flaws in David's integrity, judgment, and respect for elderly family members he believed were dependent on his guidance and control. But David remained completely unaware that every assumption, every dismissive response, and every paternalistic decision was being carefully documented by someone whose business success had been built on accurate assessment of people's character and capabilities under pressure. The second anomaly had shown that David's character flaws extended beyond simple misunderstanding into willful blindness and deliberate dismissal of evidence that threatened his assumptions about power and control in family relationships. These character defects would soon cost him everything he thought he had built for himself and his family, in the most devastating lesson about respect and assumptions that any son could ever receive from a mother he had completely underestimated and fundamentally disrespected. The devastating revelation at my 70th birthday party had accomplished everything I had hoped to achieve through 8 months of systematic character testing. But the true measure of any lesson about respect, dignity, and assumptions would be determined by the long-term changes it created in the people who witnessed it, and the broader impact it had on how elderly individuals were treated within our community and beyond. In the weeks immediately following that October evening at the Millbrook Community Center, the story of what had happened spread throughout central Pennsylvania's business community, with the kind of velocity and impact that only comes from witnessing a complete reversal of assumed power dynamics, and a devastating demonstration of the consequences that follow when people reveal their true character under pressure. The 40 guests who had attended what they thought would be a simple elderly woman's birthday celebration had instead witnessed one of the most comprehensive lessons about assumptions, respect, and elder dignity that anyone in our community had ever experienced. Each of those witnesses carried the story forward, sharing it with family members, colleagues, and friends who needed to understand the danger of making assumptions about elderly people's capabilities, worth, and autonomy based on appearance, apparent circumstances, or age-related stereotypes. Within a month, the Richardson Industries Human Resources Department began receiving inquiries from other regional employers who wanted to understand our hiring practices, employee evaluation methods, and corporate culture standards that had produced such a dramatic demonstration of the connection between personal character and professional competence. These inquiries led to consulting opportunities and educational partnerships that would eventually transform how businesses throughout Pennsylvania approached employee character assessment and elder inclusion in workplace policies. But the most significant immediate impact was felt within Richardson Industries itself, where the revelation about my identity and David's termination created a comprehensive reevaluation of our company's approach to leadership development, family dynamics in the workplace, and the integration of personal values with professional responsibilities. "Mrs. Richardson," said Janet Morrison, our Human Resources Director, during our first post-revelation management meeting, "the employees are asking questions about how personal character affects professional advancement and whether family relationships influence employment decisions within our organization." This conversation provided me with the opportunity to establish clear policies and educational programs that would ensure the lessons learned from David's character failure would benefit our entire workforce and create lasting changes in how Richardson Industries approached employee development and workplace culture. "Janet, I want you to develop a comprehensive character-based leadership training program that teaches all our supervisors and managers about the connection between personal integrity and professional competence," I instructed. "The program should specifically address respect for elderly individuals, assumptions about people's capabilities based on age or appearance, and the importance of consultation rather than control in all workplace relationships." Over the following months, the Richardson Industries Character and Leadership Development Program became a model for other regional employers who recognized the need for workplace education that addressed ageism, assumption-based decision-making, and the integration of personal values with professional responsibilities. The program's success led to speaking opportunities at industry conferences, consulting contracts with other corporations, and recognition from business associations throughout the Northeast and Southeast regions. But beyond the immediate business and educational impacts, the most important long-term consequences of my character testing experiment were being felt by elderly individuals throughout our community and region who had experienced similar disrespect, dismissal, and paternalistic treatment from family members who believed that age automatically reduced people's capacity for autonomous decision-making and valuable contributions to family and community welfare. The Richardson Foundation for Elder Dignity, which I had established in the months following the birthday party revelation, began receiving calls and inquiries from elderly people who had experienced discrimination, abuse, or systematic dismissal from family members who made assumptions about their capabilities, worth, and right to participate in decisions that affected their own lives and well-being. "Mrs. Richardson," said Margaret Walsh, an elderly woman from nearby Harrisburg, who had contacted our foundation for assistance. "My daughter has been trying to force me into assisted living because she thinks I can't manage my own household anymore. She's made all the arrangements without asking me what I want, just like your son tried to do with your marriage. Can you help me show her that I'm still capable of making my own decisions?" Margaret's situation was tragically typical of the cases that began reaching our foundation. Adult children throughout Pennsylvania were making major life decisions for elderly parents based on assumptions about age-related decline, financial vulnerability, and diminished cognitive capacity, rather than conducting respectful assessments of their parents' actual capabilities, preferences, and desires for their own futures. The Foundation's first major initiative was the development of the Elder Advocacy and Family Education Program, which provided legal support, family mediation services, and educational resources for families struggling with intergenerational conflicts about autonomy, care needs, and decision-making authority in relationships involving elderly family members. "The key insight from Eleanor's experience," explained Dr. Patricia Chen, the clinical psychologist we hired to direct the program, "is that adult children often develop paternalistic attitudes toward elderly parents not because those parents have actually lost their capabilities, but because the children have never learned to distinguish between offering assistance and assuming control, or between expressing concern and imposing decisions." The Elder Advocacy Program's approach was revolutionary in its emphasis on maintaining elderly people's autonomy and dignity, while providing support and resources that enhanced their ability to make informed decisions about their own lives. Rather than focusing on managing elderly people's supposed limitations, the program emphasized recognizing and utilizing their accumulated wisdom, experience, and capabilities, while addressing any genuine support needs through consultation and partnership rather than control and management. Within its first year of operation, the Elder Advocacy Program had assisted over 300 families in resolving conflicts about care decisions, living arrangements, financial management, and family relationships through education, mediation, and advocacy services that consistently prioritized elderly individuals' right to participate fully in decisions that affected their own lives and well-being. But the program's most significant achievement was its success in changing adult children's attitudes and approaches to elderly family relationships through education about respect, consultation, and the recognition of continued capability and worth regardless of age or apparent circumstances. "Before working with the Elder Advocacy Program, I thought my mother was becoming increasingly difficult and unreasonable about her living situation," said Robert Jenkins, whose family had participated in our mediation services. "I realized through the program that my mother wasn't becoming difficult. I was becoming controlling and dismissive. I had stopped seeing her as a competent adult whose preferences mattered and started treating her like a problem that needed to be managed." Robert's transformation was typical of the family members who participated in our educational programs. Most adult children who developed paternalistic attitudes toward elderly parents weren't intentionally disrespectful or deliberately controlling. They had simply never learned to recognize the difference between appropriate assistance and inappropriate assumption of authority, or between genuine care and systematic dismissal of their parents' autonomy and decision-making capacity. The success of our local programs led to expansion opportunities throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, where other communities were recognizing the need for educational resources and advocacy services that address the widespread problem of elder disrespect and assumption-based family decision-making. 2 years after the birthday party revelation, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Aging and Family Relationships, where I had the opportunity to share the lessons learned from my character testing experiment with gerontologists, family therapists, legal advocates, and policymakers from across the United States. "The most important lesson from my experience," I told the conference audience, "is that respect for elderly people isn't just a matter of politeness or family harmony. It's a matter of recognizing that age doesn't automatically reduce people's worth, capabilities, or right to participate in decisions that affect their own lives. When we make assumptions about elderly people's limitations without investigating their actual circumstances and capabilities, we risk destroying relationships and creating injustices that could have been avoided through simple respect and consultation." The conference presentation led to invitations to speak at universities, professional associations, and community organizations throughout the country, where the story of David's character failure and its consequences had become a powerful teaching tool for understanding the connection between personal assumptions and professional competence, family respect and individual dignity, and the importance of treating all people with the consideration they deserve, regardless of age or apparent circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful long-term impact of the birthday party revelation was the transformation it created in David himself, and his understanding of character, respect, and the treatment of elderly people in all aspects of his personal and professional life. 3 years after his termination from Richardson Industries, David had demonstrated the kind of genuine character growth and commitment to elderly dignity that convinced me to offer him the opportunity to return to our company in an entry-level position, where he could rebuild his career based on the lessons he had learned from his devastating mistakes and their consequences. "Mom," David said during our first conversation about his potential return to Richardson Industries, "I understand that any opportunity you might offer me would be based entirely on the character changes I've demonstrated and my commitment to treating elderly people with the respect and dignity they deserve, not on family relationships or forgiveness for past mistakes." David's approach to requesting a second chance revealed the depth of his transformation from someone who had assumed authority over elderly family members to someone who understood the importance of earning respect through demonstrated character and integrity, rather than expecting it through family relationships or professional position. "David, the position I'm considering offering you would involve working directly with our elder advocacy program clients and their families," I explained. "You would be helping other adult children learn to recognize the difference between appropriate assistance and inappropriate control, and teaching them about the importance of consultation, rather than assumption, in all relationships involving elderly family members." The irony of David potentially becoming an educator about elder respect and family dignity was not lost on either of us, but it also represented the most appropriate way for him to demonstrate that his character growth was genuine, and his commitment to elderly advocacy was based on personal transformation rather than simply professional necessity. "I think my experience with failing so completely to respect and understand you might actually make me more effective in helping other people recognize their own assumptions and paternalistic attitudes before they cause the kind of damage I created," David replied. "I understand what it feels like to believe you're helping elderly people while actually disrespecting and controlling them, and I might be able to help others recognize those patterns in their own behavior." David's insight about the potential value of his negative experience as a teaching tool for others facing similar challenges with elderly family relationships demonstrated the kind of self-awareness and commitment to service that suggested genuine character development, rather than simply strategic behavior designed to regain employment and financial security. Over the following year, David's work with elder advocacy program clients proved remarkably effective, precisely because of his personal experience with the devastating consequences of assumption-based decision-making and paternalistic treatment of elderly family members. His ability to recognize controlling behaviors, dismissive attitudes, and disrespectful approaches to elderly family relationships was enhanced by his own history of demonstrating exactly those character flaws and experiencing their complete destructive potential. "David helped me understand that my frustration with my father's resistance to assisted living wasn't really about his safety or care needs," said Linda Patterson, one of David's elder advocacy clients. "It was about my own discomfort with his independence, and my assumption that I knew better than he did about what would make him happy and secure. David helped me learn to ask my father what he wanted, instead of deciding what he needed." Quote, Linda's experience was typical of the families David worked with through the Elder Advocacy Program. His combination of personal experience with elder disrespect and genuine commitment to preventing others from making similar mistakes created an unusually effective approach to family education and relationship transformation. But David's most significant contribution to our elder advocacy work was his development of the Character Assessment and Family Reflection Program, which helped adult children evaluate their own attitudes and assumptions about elderly family members before those assumptions created conflicts, damaged relationships, or led to inappropriate control and decision-making authority. The program David developed asks adult children to examine their own motivations and assumptions before they offer assistance or advice to elderly family members, explained Dr. Chen. It helps them distinguish between genuine concern and paternalistic control, between appropriate support and inappropriate assumption of authority, and between respectful consultation and dismissive management of elderly people's preferences and capabilities. The Character Assessment Program became one of our most requested educational services, used by families throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, who wanted to prevent the kind of intergenerational conflicts and relationship damage that had characterized David's treatment of Frank and me during the 8-month testing period. 5 years after the birthday party revelation, Richardson Industries had become nationally recognized as a leader in elder advocacy, workplace character development, and family relationship education. Our programs were being used by corporations, educational institutions, healthcare organizations, and community groups throughout the United States, who recognized the need for comprehensive approaches to addressing ageism, assumption-based decision-making, and the integration of personal character with professional competence. But the most meaningful measure of our success was the feedback we received from elderly individuals and their families who had benefited from the educational resources, advocacy services, and cultural changes that had grown. From the lessons learned through my character testing experiment, and David's complete transformation from someone who disrespected elderly family members to someone who dedicated his life to protecting and advocating for their dignity and autonomy. Mrs. Richardson, wrote Helen Thompson, an 82-year-old woman whose family had participated in our elder advocacy program, your foundation helped my children understand that growing older doesn't mean growing less capable or less worthy of respect. They learned to ask me what I wanted instead of deciding what they thought I needed, and our relationships have never been better. Thank you for showing families like ours that elderly people deserve dignity, consultation, and respect, regardless of our age or apparent circumstances. Helen's letter was one of hundreds we received from elderly individuals and their families who had learned to build relationships based on mutual respect, consultation, and recognition of continued capability and worth, rather than assumptions about age-related decline and the need for family management and control. The Richardson Foundation for Elder Dignity had grown from a personal response to family disrespect into a comprehensive advocacy organization that was changing how elderly people were treated throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Our programs were being adapted by other states. Our educational materials were being used by universities and professional associations. And our approach to character-based family relationships was influencing policy discussions about elder rights and family responsibilities at the national level. But beyond all the professional recognition and program expansion, the most important legacy of the birthday party revelation was the personal transformation it had created in the relationships between elderly people and their adult children throughout our community and region. Families were learning to approach aging and care decisions through consultation rather than assumption, respect rather than control, and partnership rather than management. Adult children were discovering that their elderly parents often possessed wisdom, experience, and capabilities that could contribute valuable insights to family decision-making, rather than simply creating problems that required younger family members' intervention and oversight. And elderly individuals were experiencing the dignity, respect, and autonomy that should characterize all family relationships regardless of age, health status, or apparent need for assistance and support. The most important lesson from Eleanor's story, said Dr. Robert Martinez, the gerontologist who had become our national spokesperson for elder dignity and family respect, is that character and worth don't diminish with age, and that assumptions about elderly people's capabilities are often more limiting than any actual age-related changes in their circumstances or abilities. Dr. Martinez's research had shown that elderly individuals who experienced respect, consultation, and recognition of their continued capabilities from family members maintained higher levels of independence, better health outcomes, and greater life satisfaction than those who were subjected to paternalistic management and assumption-based decision-making by adult children who believed they were providing appropriate care and family responsibility. Eleanor's character testing experiment revealed a fundamental truth about human relationships, Dr. Martinez continued. People's true character is revealed most clearly when they believe they have power over others, and when they think their actions won't have consequences for their own interests and success. The most reliable measure of someone's integrity isn't how they treat people who can benefit them, but how they treat people they believe are powerless and dependent on their generosity. This insight had become central to Richardson Industries' approach to employee evaluation, leadership development, and corporate culture. but it had also influenced how families throughout our community approached relationships with elderly members, and how elderly individuals understood their own worth and rights within family dynamics. As I reflect on the 7 years that have passed since that October evening, when David handed me divorce papers as a birthday gift, I am most proud of the cultural changes that have grown from his character failure, and the lessons it taught about respect, assumptions, and the treatment of elderly people in families and communities throughout our region and beyond. Richardson Industries continues to thrive and expand, now employing over 4,000 people across 12 facility locations and generating annual revenues exceeding $400 million. But our business success has been matched by our impact on elder advocacy and family relationship education, which has touched thousands of lives and prevented countless instances of the kind of disrespect and assumption-based decision-making that characterized David's treatment of Frank and me. The Richardson Foundation for Elder Dignity has become the largest elder advocacy organization in Pennsylvania, with programs operating in 15 states and educational resources being used by families, healthcare organizations, and community groups throughout the United States. Our approach to character-based family relationships and elder dignity has influenced legislation, policy development, and professional training programs that are changing how elderly people are treated in healthcare, legal, and social service systems nationwide. David continues to work with Richardson Industries and the Elder Advocacy Program, where his personal experience with the consequences of elder disrespect has made him one of our most effective educators and advocates for family relationship transformation. His marriage ended in divorce, but he has rebuilt his life around service to elderly people and education about the importance of respect, consultation, and dignity in all family relationships. Frank and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last year, still deeply committed to the partnership that David had tried to dissolve, based on his assumptions about elderly relationships, and his qualifications to make major life decisions for people he viewed as burdens, rather than autonomous individuals deserving of respect and consultation. The business card I placed on that community center table 7 years ago still hangs in my office, along with the divorce papers David threw at me, and the termination notice that ended his employment and began his journey toward genuine character development and elder advocacy. But those artifacts are now surrounded by hundreds of letters from elderly individuals and their families who have learned to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumption-based control. The woman David thought was a helpless burden who needed his management and protection had taught him, and thousands of others, that assumptions about people's worth based on age, appearance, or apparent circumstances can be the most expensive and damaging mistakes anyone can make, but they can also become the foundation for the most important lessons about character, respect, and human dignity that transform lives and relationships for generations. This story will always be dedicated to every elderly person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or disrespected by people who should have known better. But it is also dedicated to every adult child who has learned to recognize the difference between appropriate assistance and inappropriate control, between genuine concern and paternalistic management, and between love and assumption-based decision-making that destroys dignity and autonomy in the name of care and family responsibility. The most valuable lesson isn't about hidden wealth or secret success. It's about treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, simply because they are human beings whose worth isn't diminished by age, whose capabilities aren't automatically reduced by time, and whose right to participate in decisions about their own lives doesn't expire when they reach any particular birthday or encounter any specific challenges. And sometimes, the most important tests of character are the ones people don't know they're taking, until it's too late to change the result, but not too late to learn from the consequences and dedicate the rest of their lives to ensuring that others never have to experience the same devastating lessons about respect, assumptions, and the treatment of elderly people in families and communities everywhere. That is the legacy of the birthday gift that changed everything, not just for David and our family, but for thousands of elderly individuals and their families who have learned that age brings wisdom, dignity, and continued worth that deserve recognition, respect, and celebration, rather than management, control, and assumption-based decision-making that diminishes everyone involved in family relationships that should be characterized by mutual honor, consultation, and love.